Okay, good morning, everybody. So I just would like to create some video notes about the XML namespaces, schemas, and key constraints, which I just discovered. I am far from an expert from XSD or XML writing or editing. I just would like to take a note about this finding. So I have an XSD, an XML schema defined like so. The default namespace is set for the same as the target namespace, and I also specify that all the elements in the instances has to be fully qualified, so they have to be placed into a specific namespace. But I left the attributes in the semantic space of the nodes itself. This is best to explain with these figures here. The page is seen here, so I don't want to steal the credit for just. I use this side to understand it. So if you say everything is qualified, then both the items and the attributes are located in the schema directly. But if you say that the items is qualified, then these are the items, these red blobs. It's located in the schema. Is not in the schema, in the namespace. Sorry. But the attributes itself didn't locate it in the namespace directly, but it's inside the semantic space or something like that. It was just it's called symbol space of the items, of the tags, elements. So they are basically transitively in the namespace, but this is not the same when they are directly into the namespace. So I can define an attribute which is in the symbolic scope of the element, and I can define an attribute which is directly in the symbolic scope of the namespace or in the namespace. So these are two different attributes. And for some reason, I don't know why, the key constraints didn't like unqualified names. Am sure there is some technical things that has a reason for it, but I don't know what. So anyway, I define the schema, and I define the schema as the default namespace is the same as the target namespace, and the element need to be fully qualified. And by default, the attributes are not fully qualified, but placed inside the element namespace, element scope. Okay, so let's ignore this line yet. And I also specify the XSD namespace, of course, because it's a schema definition. So I define my namespace, and I would like to create a key constraints here about the element type, and these are defined. Just a minute. What is format type here? Element type. Yeah. So this one. And it's defined here because I set the default namespace. So basically this belongs to the same namespace as the target namespace. So you can see that this one and this one and this one is the same. So basically they are in this namespace, and in the key I have to specify as XPath expression, and for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason you have to specify a fully qualified name inside this XPath expression. But since I am using the default namespace, I cannot do that, because if I leave this out here, then this is basically says that all item which match to this one, but there is no item matching this one since it's in no namespace. So it didn't match any type because this type is in the default namespace and this type is in the no namespace. So I somehow has to put into the same namespace, and this is why I created this other namespace definition or namespace abbreviation, which is the same as the default one, and this is can be used here. And since all namespaces are identified by its name, not its prefix. So this is the identifier of the namespace. So I just use two different way to note this namespace. The first is the default one, which I didn't use any prefix, and the other is this BSD prefix, binary scheme definition, just to resolve the acronym. So anyway, I can then use this BSD type as this one. And yep, and of course I have to specify the field, but let's just look at what happened if I remove this. I quickly save it and I go back to the example. And as you can see, there is no error here. And if I run my little validation script, there is no error. My validation script is just that simple. So I use this XML schema and LXML3 parser, but this is just a simple XML schema validation. So there is no error, and it's because I specified that all types which has no namespace has to have a key in the name property. But right now there is no element without a namespace because I use the default namespace. Since these types are into this namespace, and this key constraints specify the no namespace. Okay, so then I say that I use this namespace, and somebody maybe said that, oh, okay, I use this same namespace here. But it's again not good. If I save it and go back, there is a ton of errors, and if I run my validator just to see the error, not all fields key identified, so they missing the key itself. So basically they say that this type didn't have the appropriate property, and the reason is that the name is not belong to the namespace. So this property or this attributes, it's not directly into this namespace, but it's in the type scope. So if I say especially this namespace, then I will require that another property which is directly into the namespace has to be specified for each of these elements. To go back to the little figures, so if I place the namespace prefix before the attributes, I require that there be a little dot like this, so this outside attribute for each of these element. But they only have these kind of things. So the global attributes, which is directly into the namespace, and the so-called local attributes, which is in the symbol scope or symbol space of the elements itself. It's two different things. They could have the same name, as you can see here, but they are the different things. So I can use the prefix here and then use the prefix here, and then it could be resolved. Right now, I decided not to do that. So since my attributes are not fully qualified, I leave them into the symbolic scope of the element. And by doing so, I only get the appropriate error message that basically these two have the same key. So yeah. Um, this is not the only solution. So I can use a specific namespace only, and then use the namespace, this BSD namespace, everywhere in my schema definition. I think the two solution is feasible equally. I don't know which is the preferred one. Right now, I don't want to clutter my Xima definition with unnecessary BSD prefixes, so I leave my default namespace as it is. And just other side note about this, that as default, the parameters or the attributes are not qualified. So if you write something, for example, here, yeah, this is a good example also. So for example, if you write something like type and you put it into some namespace, then the attributes didn't end up in the same namespace because they are not qualified by default. So if you would like to use the same namespace, you have to explicitly say it in the attributes all the time. So this is the difference. All the elements are qualified by default based on the inheritance and the containments, but the attributes didn't. I don't know why. There may be some underlying principle which I cannot understand fully yet, but this is the case. So I hope it makes sense. And anyway, I just want to highlight and take a note about this XML schema phenomenon.